everyone. I'm Elaine Quijano. It's good to be with you. Thanks for joining us. President Biden and Russian President Vladimir Putin spoke via video conference today as Russia continues to deploy tens of thousands of troops along its shared border with Ukraine. Since Russia forcibly annexed part of Ukraine in 2014, the former Soviet Republic and the U.S. have developed closer military ties. The Biden administration has threatened consequences for increased Russian aggression and laid out some potential economic sanctions during today's call. But National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan says the door to diplomacy is still open.
If Russia further invades Ukraine, the United States and our European allies would respond with strong economic measures. He also told President Putin there's another option: de-escalation and diplomacy. The United States and our European allies would engage in a discussion that covers larger strategic issues, including our strategic concerns with Russia and Russia's strategic concerns.
Meanwhile, Congress is working to meet deadlines coming up this month, including passing the National Defense Authorization Act and raising the national debt ceiling. Democratic and Republican leaders seem to be coming to an agreement on how to get both done.
Our goal has been to increase the debt limit. We want a simple majority without a convoluted, risky, lengthy process, and it looks like the Republicans will help us facilitate that.
This will lead to a simple majority, up or down vote on raising the debt ceiling.
The Biden administration is also dealing with new international tension with China after the White House announced a diplomatic boycott of the 2022 Winter Games in Beijing, citing alleged human rights abuses by the Chinese government. Regarding a decision, a Chinese government spokesperson said today, quote, "The U.S. will pay for its wrongdoing." There are also new developments in the investigation related to the deadly January 6th Capitol insurrection. After agreeing to cooperate with investigators, Mark Meadows, former chief of staff to former President Trump, is now rescinding at least some of that cooperation. The news comes on the same day former Trump advisor Steve Bannon appeared in a virtual courtroom facing criminal contempt charges for refusing to cooperate with Congress. For more, I want to bring in Weijia Jiang, Josh Kraushaar, and Dan Balz. Weijia is a CBS News senior White House correspondent. Josh writes the column Against the Grain for the National Journal, and Dan is the chief political correspondent at the Washington Post. Welcome to you all. Weijia, let me start with you. President Biden spoke with Russian President Putin for about 2 hours today. How is the Biden administration characterizing that conversation?
Well, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan used the word useful to sum up this conversation between the two leaders. I think he was very careful not to characterize it as good or bad because there are still a lot of unknowns with regard to what Putin may or may not do when it comes to invading Ukraine. And so obviously the goal today was de-escalation, and the president, his advisors, his aides have made that very clear. But we don't know, and Sullivan admitted this himself, whether Putin has decided whether or not to move forward with that. What we do know is that there are tens of thousands of Russian troops along the border there, and certainly that sends a message in and of itself because they are not leaving at this point. So today, you know, the hope was that President Message could deliver a forceful enough message to let Putin know what the consequences would be if he were to invade. And, you know, he's been through this before. Of course, when Russia invaded back in 2014 and annexed Crimea, the president was then vice president, and he was, part of that, what is now considered a dark spot under the Obama administration's foreign policy. And so Sullivan today said that the U.S. would be willing to go further than they did back then, that they learned, from that episode, and that they are prepared to act. But Elaine, I think that, we will not be hearing whether they believe whether this was a successful call or a failed call, because obviously the situation is developing.
Yeah, well, so Dan, has the White House indicated when officials will consider tensions eased between the U.S. and Russia, or when they may take action, if not?
No, they really haven't. They've left that important question open. I think one of the things that that Jake Sullivan indicated is that at this point, the words matter much less than actions. And I think that they are going to be watching Vladimir Putin very, very closely to see what happens along that border and to see whether there's any either escalation or de-escalation on the part of the Russians. So it's an open question. And so today's call was obviously in part an effort by the president, as we just said, to make clear the consequences if there is escalation and if there is intervention, further intervention there. And the point being that they're prepared to go farther than they did in 2014. One of the things that was discussed apparently is the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline that's very important to the Russians. That's an issue that will come into play, presumably, if the Russians escalate. So, but at this point, I think that U.S. intelligence had indicated that their sense is that there could be an invasion sometime in January. So we have time to run here, and frankly, time for other conversations and things to happen before we know.
Well, Josh, on the domestic front, former Trump chief of staff Mark Meadows has gone back on his initial cooperation with the committee investigating the January 6th Capitol insurrection. Did Meadows say why?
Well, his attorney said he was upset that the committee was subpoenaing his phone records, and it's not surprising. He's one of the latest round of Trump officials to resist cooperation from the committee, following Steve Bannon, who has done the same. He's defied the committee subpoena. Former Trump Treasury official Jeffrey Clark, or Justice Department official, Jeffrey Clark, also being held in criminal contempt by the committee. So this is part of a pattern. I think for Meadows specifically, he's been feeling the heat from the former president lately. He's out with a new book with some details about Trump's COVID diagnosis and how he handled it in office that the former president isn't all that pleased about. So he may be getting heat from the former president as well, as he's hinted he might cooperate earlier on in the process. Now he's pulling back a little bit. But this is also part of a process in which Trump officials just have not been cooperating with the commission and don't seem to show any signs of cooperation anytime soon.
Weijia, back on that meeting with Russian President Putin, the White House and the Kremlin took different approaches on making the call public. President Putin's part in the call was broadcast in Russia. Did the White House say why they opted not to do that?
I think it's just because it's the precedent. It would be a lot more unprecedented if the White House were to broadcast the call. I've never seen that happen. And so I think, this is a matter of formality. They go to great lengths to make sure the call is secure. It's a longstanding U.S. policy not to record conversations that happen in the Situation Room, which gives the president the flexibility to speak with candor, to make negotiations if necessary, to deliver, words that may not be beneficial for other people to hear. And remember, they aren't just talking about Ukraine. They were talking about a host of other issues, including cyber attacks and Iran. And so if there were, as an example, bad actors who had access to every word of what President Biden was saying, there is a chance that they could glean information from that and use it to their advantage. And so, this is very typical, Elaine, for us to just get a readout, for the White House to characterize the call afterward. But certainly for conversations that happen in the Situation Room, we should not expect, I don't believe anytime soon, to be able to listen in any capacity to what the president is saying. And Dan, who, is like a walking encyclopedia to me, can weigh in on this certainly, but I think that's just the way things are done here. There's a transcription service, and they share what they want about the private calls.
Right, because, Dan, and I was going to ask you next, because to my mind, this would appear to be a major breach of protocol, to say the least, and in keeping with what some would say is a very long record by Vladimir Putin of essentially having these various moments in which there is a clear power dynamic at play. Where there's a sort of display of power here. I can remember, for instance, George W. Bush telling a story about talking about how Putin said his dog was bigger than President Bush's dog was, as just one example of how it was that there is a constant sort of posturing, and especially in the early part of an American president's time in office. Can you recall an instance like this of a call between leaders in this way being broadcast?
No, I can't. I think it's unprecedented. But we know that this is part of the MO of Vladimir Putin. There's so much machismo wrapped up in that body of his, and every opportunity he has to flex those muscles in any way possible, he's likely to do. I think that one thing that the value of President Biden's long experience is he's probably well aware of those kinds of things and probably is nonplussed by them. So, but as we just said, there's no likelihood that we're going to see these kinds of conversations from the sit room broadcast to a wider public. I mean, in order to have the kind of conversation that supposedly was to take place today, there has to be a sense of security and privacy and mutual trust. And if that evaporates, then these calls aren't worth much. So we'll see what happens going forward on this. But as I say, we just correct. I can't remember anything like this, and I don't think it's going to happen on the American side in the future.
Dan, I also want to ask you about the pandemic. So 1,600 Americans died daily from COVID-19. There is uncertainty, as we know, about the Omicron variant. Is the White House considering any kind of broader, longer-term approach to dealing with the pandemic?
I think the Biden administration is on the path that they have been on for as long as we've watched them operate, which is to try to convince more people to get vaccinated. Unfortunately, there are many, many people for whom that White House persuasion has not worked and probably won't work. So I think that all the administration can do is try to push these requirements on bigger corporations and use the power of the bully pulpit. But we've seen that there's limited power on this particular issue. This issue has become so politically polarized that it is very difficult for the president to get a hearing from people who have different views. And frankly, we also have to remember that there are some people for which this is not a political issue. This is a personal health issue, and trying to persuade them does take time. And we've seen over time that some of the people who started out as skeptics or resistant to going ahead to get a vaccination have come around, whether because of what the government has said or what they've seen or what friends have persuaded them or family members. But it is a long, slow process given where we are at this point. There was a rush among people who wanted to get vaccinated to get vaccinated. We've seen the similar thing with the boosters. People who were ready to get boosters went out very quickly and got boosters. But for people who have been hanging back, it's a much, much more difficult challenge for the administration.
All right, let's turn to Capitol Hill. Josh, Congress seems to have a plan to raise the national debt ceiling. What does that agreement between Republicans and Democrats look like?
Well, it means that Republicans are going to pass a vote to essentially lower the threshold to allow Democrats to actually raise the debt ceiling. So, I mean, politically speaking, and I don't think people are going to be remembering this vote come next year's midterm elections, but politically it puts Democrats on the record as raising the debt ceiling, being held politically accountable for the additional spending taking place. But, it's also an example of some behind-the-scenes bipartisanship between Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and Minority Leader Mitch McConnell. The expectation was that McConnell was gonna kind of take this to the brink, try to get a lot of leverage as much as he could from Democrats. That really didn't happen. I think both parties recognize that it's not in anyone's political interest to being seen as holding up the country's economy and fiscal standing at a time where a lot of Americans are facing a lot of anxiety economically of their own. And in the big picture, it's kind of remarkable that we're close. We have 8 days to spare, which is a little bit unusual. We usually always kind of tiptoe right next to the cliff before cutting a deal at the very last minute. This looks like we've gotten a deal in place with some time to spare, which is unusual at the end of the year in Washington.
Highly unusual. All right, Weijia, a new Wall Street Journal poll finds 57% of voters disapprove of President Biden and are especially unhappy with his handling of the economy. How is the administration trying to deal with that ahead of midterms?
So this is just the latest in a series of polls, including CBS News, that really shows the same thing, that Americans are not happy with the way the president is handling the economy. And he is well aware of this, as is the White House. And so they have been trying to signal that he has taken steps already to do something about it. They point to the recently passed bipartisan infrastructure law as one way to create a lot of new jobs and to get money flowing. The president recently released 50 million barrels of oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to try to bring down those gas prices. He's taken a number of steps to try to unclog what we are seeing unfold at ports across the country, especially out west, that have impacted the supply chain. The problem, Elaine, is that he does not have time on his side, and all of those things are going to take time for Americans to feel any kind of impact, as is his next piece in his domestic agenda to try to revive the economy, which is Build Back Better, to offer a social safety net for people to have more protection as they go out into the workforce. But let's remember that we are still in the middle of a deadly pandemic, and attached to that is reservations about going back to work and a host of other issues. And that's exactly why, Elaine, that despite the arrival of this new Omicron variant, the president has made very clear that he is going to keep the economy open and schools open, that there will not be more lockdowns and shutdowns if he has anything to do about it. He's trying to take every other measure he can before going there, because he recognizes that the economy needs help right now. And he's always viewed this as a pair of crises, both the pandemic and the economy. But the problem, again, is it's going to take time. This has to play out. People have to feel more confident. And right now, that's not something he has. However, the White House is banking on eventually, sooner than later, people seeing the impact and those numbers turning around before the midterms. But we'll see.
All right, Weijia, Josh, and Dan, thank you all very much. Appreciate it.